Verifying a social security number. Verifying that a social security number is valid for work. For most of the credits that we just discussed, you have to know whether or not the taxpayer's social security number is valid for work. For example, if the taxpayer's social security card says not valid for employment, like this one right here on the right, then that social security number is still a valid social security number, but it's not valid for employment, so it's not a valid social security number for EITC purposes. The only way to really know this for sure is to actually see a copy of the social security card. Now, the IRS does not require you to verify social security cards. I want you to understand that. And I'm going to show you on the IRS website where it says that, because I've had tax practitioners argue with me about that point, and even sometimes IRS employees will tell you that it's mandatory, but it's not mandatory. It's not mandatory to actually review social security cards. And, there's other ways to know if a taxpayer has a social security number that's valid for employment. If, for example, the taxpayer has a U.S. passport, if they're a U.S. citizen, then their social security number is going to be valid for employment because it's a U.S. citizen. They have their social security numbers are valid for employment. So if you see a passport and it's a U.S. passport, then you know that their social security number is valid. But sometimes this can be a little bit nebulous. Sometimes people are in the United States and they have a specific type of visa, and you can't really be sure without looking at the social security card. Now, if it says valid for work only with DHS authorization, this is a social security card that's valid for employment. And then if it says nothing, then generally that's a U.S. citizen and it's valid for employment. Okay, if it's just blank like this. Now, here I am on the IRS website. This is the EITC Toolkit or EITC Central. This is for helping paid preparers learn how to navigate these credits, and especially EITC, because that's the one that we see the most, and also the refundable credit where there's the most abuse, like fraud. This is eitc.irs.gov. That's the actual website. Now, let me show you the document. And here's the document. This is due diligence facts for paid preparers. This is following are some of the questions preparers asked us about fulfilling the refundable credit due diligence requirements and our answers. So these are the IRS answers on the right, and these are the preparer questions on the left. And I'm going to include this PDF in your downloads and the resources along with the handout for this webinar. But this is freely available on the IRS website. This is directly from the IRS. If you scroll down a little bit, it talks about birth certificates as well as social security cards. It says right here, must I review the birth certificate to verify the age of a qualifying child? The IRS answer says, no, it's not required. But if you have reason to question a child's age, you may want to request the birth certificate. If the client provides a birth certificate and you use it to determine eligibility for or for the amount of the EITC, the CTC, or the AOTC, you need to keep a copy of the birth certificate. So you don't have to review the birth certificate. It's not technically required. But if you do review the birth certificate for any of these refundable credits, then you have to keep a copy of the birth certificate. Does that make sense? Okay. And now about the social security cards. Must I review social security cards or keep a copy? And once again, the IRS says no. There is no requirement to review social security cards, but it is a best practice to review them. So it's not mandatory, but the IRS does consider it a best practice. You are more likely to get the child's name and number correct if copied directly from the card. And actually, I'll tell you something. I'll tell you something with regards to social security cards, especially if you have a person who has an ethnic name. There's a lot of ethnic names in my family where people have like hyphenated last names. So we have De La Souza de Silva, that sort of thing. Sometimes I have to try multiple times to try to get the e-file to go through. I mean, only the first time, right? Only the first time, and then you figure it out. But it makes it a lot easier if you can actually see what's on the social security card. Sometimes you really need to look at it, and it makes it a lot easier to input it into your software to see how it's on the social security card. You don't know which one's the middle name. You don't know whether the last name is two last names or not. You know, my husband, His name it's two last names. It's like a hyphenated last name. It's a Hispanic last name. And then in my family too, we have like De La Rocha, De La Souza, that sort of thing. You have to look at it because you don't know if the De La is together or if it's two words or even three words sometimes. You won't know. And so you either actually look at a passport or look at the Social Security card to get it right. So it does make it easier to see the Social Security card, to input the last name, especially if it's a complicated name, into your software. It helps prevent rejects, e-file rejects. I'll just tell you that right now, okay? Having copies of the cards is helpful in resolving e-file rejects. If the client does provide a Social Security card and you use it to determine eligibility for or the amount of the EITC, the CTC, or the AOTC, you need to keep a copy of the card with your records. You don't have to request Social Security cards. It is not mandatory. But if you do request them, then you have to keep a copy of them for your records if you actually require the taxpayer to bring those in. It's not required for IRS purposes, right? There's no requirement to review Social Security cards. It's just a best practice. So they strongly recommend that you do, but they can't force you to do it, basically. But they do consider it a best practice. And then if you do require the Social Security cards or birth certificates as a type of ID, then you have to keep a copy for your records. Note, preparers are not always required to ask for documents to prove the relationship and residency of a qualifying child before completing a claim for a refundable credit, although a paid preparer may request those documents if the information provided by the client appears to be incorrect, inconsistent, or incomplete. Now I have a little practice tip for you from one tax preparer to another. If you have a tax practice that does a lot of these types of refundable claims, like a lot of EITC or child tax credit claims, that you should make copies of this form and just have a stack of them in your office. This is the form 886HEIC. This makes it so easy for you to get the paperwork that you need from the client. You just download this form, you write in the taxpayer's name, their identification number, the tax year right here, and then you just highlight what you want from them. This form makes it so much easier for you to do your job. You don't have to argue with the taxpayers. You just say, oh, well, this is a new requirement. The IRS is requiring us to get these records, and you just highlight what you want. And this says that it's a Department of the Treasury Internal Revenue Service. It's an official form from the IRS. And this form is basically making it easy for you to get the records that you need to complete the tax return. You can say, oh yeah, this is a new requirement. Because a lot of times the taxpayers will push back. They don't want to dig up these records. They don't want to do the work. They don't want to look for the birth certificates or court records or whatever, if it's a divorce or custody or whatever. Many times you might not feel comfortable because it's a new client and you don't know these people, right? But you want certain records and you'll get pushback from them. They'll say, why do I have to do this? My last preparer didn't require me to do this. Why do I have to get these records for you? I didn't have to do it before. Then you could just say, oh, this is a new thing. Just use this form, highlight whatever you want from them and give it to them and say, okay, so I need, your court records, or I need school records. I need a birth certificate, whatever, and highlight it, give it to them and say, when you have these records, then bring them back to me along with this form. And we can complete your tax return then. You just give them this form, highlight what you need, and tell them, when you have these records, to bring them back to me, and we'll complete your tax return as soon as you can get those to me. Makes everything a lot easier, I'm telling you. There's a lot less pushback if they see something like this, something that looks official. And it is an Internal Revenue Service form, so you can use this if you're getting like pushback from the clients about getting their records together.